Okay, so the YouTube feed is up and going. And then Christian, once I introduce you and you start the talk, I'll pin you so that we can all see you front and center. For now, so the YouTube feed is up and going. Oh, sorry. I've got to mute it so I don't hear myself in the feedback because there's a lag on the YouTube. Okay, so let me go over what we're doing. Okay, so some of you came to the last one. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that part. So welcome to ARRG. Oh, why didn't that work? Sorry, wrong thing. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so for those of you who were here last time, thanks for coming back. If you weren't here last time, this is the second installment of the AARG Agency and Responsibility Research Group. Today we're honored to have Christian List. He's going to give a talk called A Case for Scientific Realism about Free Will. A little bit about the sort of goals of the group moving forward. So I want to try to host at least 3 talks per semester. That's what I'm doing this fall and in the spring. But there are other things that I want to do as well. As I'll say in a minute, I've already worked on set up the panelists for one roundtable discussion. I'm in the process of sending out some invites for a second one. Hopefully they'll be next summer. It'd be nice if people are interested in sort of workshops where they can talk about their works in progress, where we could all meet and consider or discuss what we've all been working on without having to give like full-blown talks. Here again, if people are interested in them, I'm happy to organize them. I'm going to do some events that are just about the empirical work on beliefs about free will, which I do quite a bit of these days. And then also, which is important to me, events aimed specifically at highlighting the work by junior researchers. I'm going to try to start organize one of those for next fall. And so those of you who are senior philosophers, be prepared to get invited to comment on these junior philosophers' papers, because that's the way this is going to be structured, I hope. All the events will be hosted synchronously on Zoom and live stream on YouTube, and then the talks will be recorded and posted both here on the ARRG homepage and on the YouTube page. So upcoming events. So Carolina Sartorio is giving a talk in December. You can get all this on the homepage. Justin Capes will be presenting, providing the commentary. John Martin Fisher is talking in January. Corey Clark is talking in March. Dana Nelkin is talking in April. And then Al Mealy, Eddie Namias, Adina Roskis, and John Dylan Haynes have very graciously agreed to do a roundtable discussion on free will and science. We haven't figured out the date yet. That's going to be because it's a bit in the future, so it's hard to plan these things this far in advance. But hopefully that'll happen sometime next summer. And then, like I said, I'm sending out invites for another roundtable discussion on psychopaths and moral responsibility. So hopefully I'll have some more on that soon. So hopefully there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the pipeline. So for the event today, please mute your audio for the talk and leave it muted throughout. When the talk ends, if you have questions, please use the hand raise icon. If the speaker didn't have time to answer your question, because we may have to cut out before all the questions get answered, please just add it to the chat, and I'll make sure they receive it after the talk. So they might, Christian might enjoy seeing all the questions, even if he doesn't have time to field them all. So I'll be happy to do that. The chat is already open. I already placed the URL for the homepage for ARRG if you want to see that. If you'd like, it'd be nice to see your location and or affiliation in the chat. It'd be nice for me to keep up with like who's watching from where. And then if you have any suggestions for speakers and or roundtable discussions you'd like to see in the future, just post them in the chat and I'll be happy to take them into consideration. Okay, after the event, as I said, the recorded video will be posted on the ARRG homepage. It'll be posted in the current link that has the information for Christian's talk, so you can use the same URL you used to find the Zoom and everything else. That will also serve as a discussion thread for people who missed the talk or who still had issues they'd like to discuss with one another. I'll leave these discussion threads open for a week for reasons I could explain if you email me. Everyone is welcome to participate, even encouraged to participate in these threads. While speakers may participate, so I'll send them the link. They're not expected to do so. They're already donating their time and energy to try to facilitate the building of this community in the first place. So I don't want to ask more of them, but if they want to, they can. I think we had a decent discussion. Only a few of us in the last, after Dirk's talk, but maybe John, I, and Neil, and I think Dirk had some interesting things to say. So if you're interested in that, you'll be able to do that as well. Okay, so Christian's bio. So Christian List is professor of philosophy and decision theory and co-director of the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. His research lies at the intersection of philosophy, economics, and political science, with a particular focus on individual and collective decision-making and the nature of intentional agency. A growing part of his work addresses metaphysical questions, for example, about free will, causation, probability, and the relationship between micro and macro levels in the human and social sciences, which is largely what this latter stuff is what he'll be talking about today. So I'm very excited. This is a copy of his book that has been widely reviewed. And so if you haven't had a chance to read it, I certainly suggest you do so. Today should whet your appetite for much of what he says in the book. So that having been said, please join me in welcoming our guest, Christian List. Okay, Christian, I'm going to peg you to the top. Wait a second. Do you need to share anything?
Yes, please. So I'll start.
Yeah. Sorry. Just give me 1 second. Let me pin you first. Okay, you should be able to share now. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? Great. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be part of this exciting series of events, and it's great to see so many people here, and I very much look forward to the discussion with all of you. So I'm going to speak about a case for scientific realism about free will. Now, free will on a first gloss is an agent's capacity to choose and control his or her own actions. And sometimes this is also called freedom of action. But I'm going to use free will simply because it's the conventional and most widely used term. Now, this idea that we are capable of choosing and controlling our own actions is absolutely central to our self-understanding as agents, and it's also central to our practices of assigning responsibility to one another in both morality and the law. So, in short, it's really one of those key ideas that we take to characterize the human condition. But in recent years, free will has come under attack in science, especially in neuroscience, and also in popular commentary on science. And if you look at popular science writings, let's say you browse through popular science magazines or through popular science books in a bookshop, you're going to find plenty of articles or books which argue that free will is an illusion. And I give you just one representative quotation. So here it is. Our thoughts and actions are the outputs of a computer made of meat, our brain. A computer that must obey the laws of physics. Our choices, therefore, must also obey those laws. This undermines the traditional idea of free will, that our lives comprise a series of decisions in which we could have chosen otherwise. This is Jerry Coyne, a biologist. In his answer to the question, what scientific idea is ready for retirement? And his answer is free will is the scientific idea that's ready for retirement. Now, this kind of skepticism about free will is less common in academic philosophy. David Bourget and David Chalmers conducted a widely cited survey of the views of professional philosophers. And one relatively recent installment of that survey is from 2014. And in that survey, a clear majority expressed the belief in free will. So around 59% described themselves as free will compatibilists, 13.7% described themselves as free will libertarians. I suppose the support for free will is still stronger in the professional philosophy community than free will skepticism. But I think it's fair to say that at least if we look at public discourse that is inspired by popular perceptions of what science allegedly shows, then free will skepticism is really on the rise. And what I want to do here is to argue that free will can be defended against this scientifically motivated skepticism, and crucially, that this can be done without denying science or without redefining free will itself. I mean, one relatively cheap way of reconciling free will with science would simply be to step by step water down the notion of free will so as to remove the, let's say, offending bits, those that seem incompatible with certain scientific claims, and then the reconciliation is accomplished. But the worry is that we then end up with a notion of free will that is far too thin to do the sort of work that we expect a conception of free will normally to do in our philosophical worldviews. So my central thesis is that far from being undermined by a scientific worldview, the idea of free will, understood in quite a robust way that I'm going to explain more carefully, is actually supported by it. And so in short, there is a case for scientific realism about free will. Now, the talk is short, so I can't develop that case in full detail, but I'm going to sketch my overall argumentative strategy here. The details are in the book that Thomas already kindly cited earlier on, and also in a series of articles on free will and mental causation, some of which are jointly authored with the late Peter Menzies and also with Vlodek Rabinovich. And for those who are interested in the more technical articles, you can find them on my webpage. And in addition, I'd like to mention that there is a paper that sort of accompanies this talk. It's called The Naturalistic Case for Free Will, and you can find it at the displayed address here. And this paper also contains more detailed bibliographic references and citations, which for brevity I'm omitting from the talk itself. But if you go to the paper, you'll find a full list of references. Here's the plan. So I'll begin with a summary of what I take to be the most salient scientifically motivated challenges for free will. And then I'll give an initial diagnosis of what I think is going on with those challenges. And that then sort of sets the scene for the more constructive part of my talk, which is to sketch an indispensability argument for assuming or postulating free will. And that indispensability argument is structurally much like the kinds of indispensability arguments that scientific realists tend to give for accepting the reality of various other properties across the sciences. And I'll explore that argument. I mean, I'm not going to defend all the ingredients of the argument fully and properly, but again, I'll give you a skeleton which hopefully conveys the overall gist of my approach. And then finally, I conclude with some broader remarks about the resulting picture of free will. Okay, so let's begin with the challenge. Now, I suggest that a reasonable starting point for the discussion of free will is the assumption that free will requires some or perhaps all of the following properties. First of all, intentional agency. So it seems quite clear that only entities or systems or beings that qualify as intentional agents are even candidates for having free will. Some entity that falls short of intentional agency is just not a plausible candidate for free will at all. I've got my water bottle here. I mean, that's not even a candidate for free will. So intentional agency clearly is a requirement for free will. Secondly, I'm here suggesting that free will requires alternative possibilities among which that agent can choose. Now that's the famous can do otherwise requirement for free will. So in order to say that a particular choice was free, it has to be the case that in an appropriate sense of possible, it had to be possible for the agent to do otherwise. And more on this later. And then thirdly, I suggest free will requires mental causation. It requires the causation of the resulting actions by the relevant mental states, especially the agent's intentions. So if it were the case that what I do is caused by some sub-intentional, subconscious, purely bodily physical process and not by my relevant intentional mental state, then it's hard to really attribute this action fully to me as an agent. And then once again, this is not really a case of the exercise of free will. So that's why I think those three requirements are necessary for free will. But that said, not every proponent of free will thinks that all three properties are really needed. In particular, some free will compatibilists think we don't need alternative possibilities among which we can choose. Some notion of agential endorsement or ownership or authorship in relation to the relevant actions would already suffice. But for the sake of argument, I want to grant that free will requires suitable versions of all three of these and not just of a subset. And so in that sense, my starting point is a relatively strong set of assumptions about what the requirements for free will are. Clearly, those need to all be spelled out in much more detail. I mean, I've just sketched them here, but I'm going to say more about them as we go along. Now, the skeptics tend to focus on one or more of these properties. Let's just call it property P, and then they claim that science shows that there is no such thing as property P. In particular, they say property P is not to be found among the fundamental physical features of the world, or the features that are real according to whatever they take to be the relevant fundamental scientific theory. Perhaps, they say, property P is just a convenient fiction of our folk psychological way of thinking, whichever one it might be: intentional agency, alternative possibilities for choice, or mental causation. In our folk psychological way of thinking, we certainly assume that humans have property P, but the skeptical argument says, property P just has no place in fundamental physics or fundamental science. So if P is required for free will, then it would seem to follow there is no free will. Different arguments against free will from this scientifically motivated camp now target different substitution instances for property P. So some arguments suggest that intentional agency is an illusion. There are no genuine intentional systems in a physical world at all. And I call this the challenge from radical materialism. And you'll find not just the popular science version of this in some of the popular science writings that I was referring to, but there are also sophisticated academic versions, for instance, in the form of fairly radical eliminativist materialism that is defended by neurophilosophers Patricia and Paul Churchland. Others assert that we have no alternative possibilities in a deterministic universe. That's the classic challenge from determinism, perhaps the most discussed challenge for free will in the literature. And here again, you find not just the pop science versions, but one of the most famous academic versions of this can be found in Peter van Inwagen's classic consequence argument. And then a third set of arguments insists that intentions, human intentions, our intentions, even if they exist, never cause our actions. So when I act, it's my brain that makes me do it. Some subconscious, sub-intentional physical brain state that is causally responsible for what I do, but not my intentional mental states. Intentions then are only subjectively experienced byproducts. We can call this the challenge from epiphenomenalism. Again, there are not just the popular versions of that challenge, but also sophisticated academic ones. For instance, in the form of Benjamin Libet's classic neuroscience experiments that were interpreted by Libet and others as showing that it's really the neuronal readiness potentials that are the causes of at least certain spontaneous motor actions and not the intentional choices to perform those actions. But another kind of version of this argument is also Jack Von Kim's very influential causal exclusion argument against mental causation, or in a physicalist world, or at least against mental causation, on the assumption that mental states are distinct from underlying physical brain states. Okay, now these are formidable challenges, and they are serious challenges and have also been properly developed. And so we need to ask what we can say in response. And this now takes me to an initial diagnosis. Now, I think the scientifically inspired free will skepticism tends to take a fairly reductionistic perspective on human beings. In effect, it views people as physical systems or biophysical systems, heaps of interacting particles or heaps of interacting cells, you might say. And it's no surprise that from that perspective, one finds very little support for intentional agency, alternative possibilities for choice, or mental causation, simply because these notions don't occur in the descriptions of the world given to us by the physical sciences, or even by neuroscience, by the sort of neuroscience that studies the brain primarily as a biophysical system. But it's clear that the sciences are not restricted to physics and the natural sciences alone, and also the sciences of human behavior are by no means restricted to neuroscience. And my claim is that it is in the relevant special sciences, such as the human and social sciences, combined with a non-reductive physicalist approach, that we can find support for realism about free will and its prerequisites, which I suggested are agency, choice, and mental causation. Now, just to give a simple analogy, think of organisms or institutions or economic growth. If we were to look at the world solely through the lens of physics, those phenomena would simply remain hidden from view. We'd see particles, fields, and forces, but we wouldn't see organisms, institutions, or economic growth. But we wouldn't deny the reality of those phenomena. And that's because from the fact that biological and social phenomena are absent from physical descriptions, they don't feature among the ontological furniture of the world as postulated by certain fundamental physical theories. From that, it simply doesn't follow that they are unreal. Rather, they are higher level phenomena. They are products of physical processes. Facts about them are, if physicalism is right, supervenient on underlying physical facts, but they are not describable using the concepts and categories of the physical sciences alone. And it would still not normally occur to us to be anti-realists about them. We're not generally anti-realists about properties or entities postulated by those higher level special sciences. Now, my suggestion is that what is true for those other higher level phenomena is equally true for the properties that are required for free will, agency, choice, and mental causation. And so I suggest that these also emerge from physical processes. Facts about them are supervenient on physical facts, but they don't feature in fundamental physical descriptions of the world. And now I want to develop my case for this kind of scientific realism about free will in just a little bit more detail. And the overall argumentative strategy is to give an indispensability argument. And maybe just to very briefly step back, think about why physicists have come to accept that certain elementary particles genuinely exist, let's say the Higgs boson. It's ultimately because those particles feature in the descriptions of the world given to us by the best scientific theories of the relevant domain. For instance, the standard model of particle physics in this case. Those theories are well confirmed. Those theories are internally coherent. And then scientists are quite prepared to take this as good enough evidence to include those particles in our ontology. And of course, they do so in the spirit of science. The acceptance of something in the scientific ontology is provisional. I mean, in principle, some future falsification could come up, the relevant theories could be overthrown, and the issue needs to be revisited. But once the existence of a particular entity, of a particular property, is sufficiently supported by our best scientific theories of the relevant domain, then scientists tend to be realists about that entity or property. Now, here's the argument that I want to give for realism about free will, and unpacking this as an argument for realism about intentional agency, alternative possibilities for choice, and mental causation or causal control. The first premise of the argument is that our best explanations of human behavior depict humans as choice-making agents, agents with beliefs, desires, and intentions, alternative possibilities to choose from, and mental causation. This depiction is indispensable and compatible with the rest of science. And so far, I'm just stating the premise, and then I'll explain more about why I think the premise is actually true. And at any rate, this premise is a scientific premise. Whether it's true or false is not something that can be adjudicated just from an armchair, and it can't be adjudicated by philosophical reflection alone. But whether this premise is true or not ultimately hinges very much on what the sciences of human behavior have to say. My second premise is this: if postulating certain properties or entities is indispensable in our best explanations of a given phenomenon and compatible with the rest of science, then we are at least provisionally warranted in taking those properties or entities to be real. Now, that's a philosophical premise, and in fact, that's a version of what is known as the naturalistic ontological attitude, which goes back to Quine, Fine, but which underlies much of a very influential standard case for scientific realism in many domains. So the idea is basically to figure out which entities and properties are real. We consult our best sciences of the relevant domains, and those give us the best guide to the appropriate ontology, and then we can be realists about the commitments of those best theories. I mean, provided those theories cross a certain threshold of maturity, well-supportedness by the evidence, coherence, and provided they are well integrated into the rest of our scientific worldview. Now, if we put those two premises together, then we get the conclusion that we are at least provisionally warranted in taking intentional agency, alternative possibilities, and mental causation to be real. And if indeed we define free will in the way I've suggested we do, then the support for realism about free will follows from those two premises. So that's the argument. Now, since my goal is to defend free will against naturalistically or scientifically inspired skepticism, I'm going to take the second premise, the naturalistic ontological attitude, as given here, because that's something that is perhaps less likely to be challenged by at least those critics or skeptics who are sort of fully committed to the standard scientific enterprise. And I simply note that it's supported by standard arguments for scientific realism, and arguably also very much in line with the working practices in the real sciences. So my task then is to defend the second premise, which is the claim that the picture of humans as choice-making agents is indispensable in the human and social sciences and compatible with the rest of science. So that's, I think, where the action now really lies. And in the book that I mentioned, I devote one chapter to each ingredient of this picture of humans, namely intentional agency, alternative possibilities to choose from, and mental causation. And here I clearly don't have enough time to go over all of this in detail. So I'm going to discuss intentional agency relatively briefly, then I'm going to focus on alternative possibilities to choose from, and I'm going to omit mental causation simply because of time constraints. But in case anyone would like to bring up questions about my take on mental causation in this context, then the Q&A period would be the right time for that. Now let's begin with intentional agency. It's fair to say that the human and social sciences, which are a very broad field, from anthropology and psychology to sociology and economics, it's fair to say that they differ widely in their methods and approaches, and there are many disagreements that you find among them. But one feature they have in common is that they understand humans as intentional agents, as beings with goals and beliefs and with a capacity for perception and thought, who act in at least approximately intelligible ways. There's much discussion about the differences between these different human and social sciences. And I mean, it's widely recognized that, for instance, the discipline of microeconomics, by and large, uses a different model of human behavior and somewhat different explanatory schemes, and makes different assumptions about human behavior than, let's say, anthropology or sociology. But in the midst of all of these methodological and substantive differences, the fact that there is actually this one key point of agreement is really quite often missed, namely the point that across all of these different fields, there is a background assumption that humans are intentional agents. And I mean, here again, the characterization is that beings with goals and beliefs and with a capacity for perception and thought who act in at least approximately intelligible ways. The details of what exactly then all of this involves are spelled out somewhat differently by those fields. That's a fair point, but the big picture assumption of intentional agency is really quite widely shared. And I think that that's actually the case for very good reasons. Now consider questions such as the following. Why do people usually show up for work rather than stay at home? Why do they choose one consumption bundle rather than another? Why and when do they keep their promises? Why do they vote the way they do? I think we wouldn't know where to begin if we tried to answer these questions without viewing people as intentional agents. So intentional explanations are, for very good reasons, ubiquitous in the human and social sciences. Sub-intentional explanations, let's say physical explanations or neuroscientific explanations, they aren't remotely capable of accounting for human behavior in its full breadth and flexibility. You'd have no hope on giving satisfactory answers to the questions listed above solely by invoking even the best sciences of the sub-intentional, sub-psychological level. Sub-intentional explanations, for instance, those that we find in sophisticated versions of neuroscience, I think they may be better viewed as attempts to illuminate the neural implementation mechanisms of intentional agency. And that's very important. So I don't want to belittle those research achievements at all. They're hugely illuminating. But I don't think that they should be viewed as replacing intentional explanations. And so here I very much agree with Daniel Dennett, who has argued influentially that there are systems for which taking an intentional stance, viewing them as intentional agents, is simply explanatorily required. And that's why I think that postulating intentional agency continues to be explanatorily indispensable, despite the advances that have been made in fields such as neuroscience. Now, once we explain people's behavior in intentional terms by viewing them as intentional agents, the idea that they have alternative possibilities to choose from actually becomes indispensable too. And that's perhaps a somewhat less widely recognized point. I think I still have a lot of people on board with the claim that ascriptions of intentional agency are explanatorily indispensable, at least for a large domain of purposes. So let me explain then why I think the postulate of alternative possibilities is also explanatorily indispensable in the human and social sciences. Consider questions such as, why does an agent act in such and such a way? Or what would he or she do in such and such a situation? Now, when we answer those questions, I think we engage in a three-step hypothesis process. So we hypothesize, first of all, that the agent is faced with some options, which are his or her possible choices. We then hypothesize that the agent somehow considers those options or deliberates about them. And these words here are just a placeholder for anything that can range from slow and rational and deliberate to fast and spontaneous. So that many ways this can be spelled out, but there are options, and there are in some ways processed, considered, or deliberated about by the agent. And then finally, the agent selects one option among the possible ones in a way that is intelligible, perhaps approximately rational, if not fully rational, given the agent's beliefs and desires and other relevant mental states. You'll find that when you answer these why questions about, why an agent acted in a particular way, or what question, or what an agent would do in a particular situation, either explicitly or at least implicitly, you're going to make use of this three-step explanatory scheme, which I suggest is simply at the root of the whole project of intentional explanation. And again, then the details of this are spelled out very differently by different human and social sciences. And this explanatory scheme manifestly presupposes that agents have alternative possibilities to choose from. That's sort of the first step within this three-step scheme. Recall the earlier examples of questions that I've given. Why do people usually show up for work? Why do they choose one particular consumption bundle rather than another? Why and when do they keep their promises? Why do they vote the way they do? An intentional explanation of the behaviors in question wouldn't get off the ground if we didn't suppose that people make choices between different possible options. And indeed, intentional explanations very often take this contrastive form. Why was one option chosen rather than another? And if you were not prepared to make that initial assumption that there are different options possible for the agent, the whole scheme wouldn't get started. And even in economics, with its at first sight mechanistic picture of people as maximizers of utility, although I want to emphasize that that's really a caricature, and sophisticated economic models are nowhere near as simplistic as this sort of caricature picture suggests. And even there, the notion of choice between different options is absolutely central. So the presupposition there is that agents sometimes face choices, and when they do, more than one option is in principle possible for them, even if only some of the options may be rational and will ultimately be chosen according to the relevant explanatory theories. So the agent's trajectory up to any relevant choice node admits different agentially possible continuations. That's the sort of background presupposition that you'd find in these economic models, or which you'd also find in other decision theoretic models of the sort that are being employed in psychology or cognitive science, or the social sciences, political science, and neighboring fields. And I call this thesis agential indeterminism. I think it's a background presupposition which is there, which is quite central to the explanatory practices at hand, but it's a surprisingly unacknowledged background assumption. So one of my messages is really to emphasize, look, we must really recognize that there is a presupposition of agential indeterminism in the background of decision theoretic explanations broadly construed. And the idea can be illustrated by considering an extensive form decision tree of the sort that is often modeled in decision and game theory. And I'm sure most or all of you will have seen these decision trees. So such a decision tree represents all the possible decision paths that the relevant agent, or if it's a multi-agent setting, the relevant agents could take, moving from bottom to top. So each of these dots is a choice node, and then at this choice node, the relevant agent could, choose one thing, which here, let's say, corresponds to going left, and choose another thing which corresponds to going right. And there's another choice node where, again, a choice arises. And so the background assumption is that any path along that tree from top to bottom, wherever you end up, is in principle agentially possible. Now, in decision theoretic or game theoretic explanations, we then typically want to formulate explanatory theories which employ, for instance, equilibrium concepts, drawing on certain notions of rationality, and based on those, predictions are being made, namely that against the background of assumption of some form of rationality, agents will choose one particular path rather than another. And so let's suppose the red path is the one predicted by our explanatory version of decision theory, or let's suppose it's the one that is sort of picked out as rational by some appropriate equilibrium concept, and then against some background assumption of rationality it's predicted. But you could run the same story with an assumption of bounded rationality, and then you'd again make a prediction along those lines. Now, importantly, even if one path is identified as rational or as predicted, the other paths remain possible. So the mere picking out as one path, as the sort of solution picked out by the solution concept, which is then the behavioral prediction of the theory, in no way undermines the background assumption that all these other paths were possibilities in the first place. And indeed, the assumption that these other paths were possibilities in the first place is actually crucial to even developing and setting up the appropriate equilibrium concept. I mean, you only come up with the prediction that such and such path is the rational one under certain assumptions against the background of a whole bunch of modal claims about, what would happen if the agent were to do this and that and the other. Agential indeterminism of this sort, so the idea that at each choice node there's more than one agentially possible continuation, as in these extensive form decision trees that I've shown you. Agential indeterminism doesn't mean that choices are random. So that's very, very important. It merely means that agents face choices between different options that are in principle possible. And I'm going to say agentially possible, open to them as agents. And as noted, this is consistent with some options being rational and identified as such in deliberation, and other options not being rational. So this distinction of what is possible to do for an agent and what is rational to do for an agent, and what the agent therefore will do under some background assumption of rationality, that distinction is at the heart of decision theory. And so that's why I want to emphasize that even if you go with a sort of crudest picture of humans as rational utility maximizers, and there's always a unique rational utility maximizing thing to do, I mean, even if you make that kind of very strong and simplistic orthodox assumption of some versions of economics, you'd still not move away from the background assumption that you've got multiple options to begin with that were agentially possible. And so my claim is simply that in explanations of human behavior, we routinely assume, and we must assume for good explanatory reasons, non-singleton sets of possible options. Now, even if I'm right that agential indeterminism is presupposed by the human and social sciences, one might still worry that it conflicts with physical determinism. And physical determinism, after all, has not yet been ruled out by science. Some bits of fundamental physics give us a deterministic picture. Other bits of fundamental physics, depending on how you interpret them, may or may not give us an indeterministic picture. So it's probably fair to say that the jury is still out on the question of whether our best future theory of fundamental physics turns out to be deterministic or indeterministic in its depiction of the fundamental laws of nature. Now, physical determinism means, very roughly speaking, this can be made much more precise, that the fully specified physical trajectory of the world up to any time admits only one possible future continuation under the laws of physics. So just as the date and time of the next solar eclipse in New York is fixed by the current state of the solar system, according to classical physics, and I mean, these predictions are very reliably then borne out by the real course of events. So determinism seems to imply all future human actions are fixed. So the fact that we are all in this virtual meeting room today would already have been fixed and fully necessitated by the initial state of the universe under the laws of nature. Now, doesn't agential indeterminism, as I have argued, is an indispensable assumption of the human and social sciences, doesn't this conflict with physical determinism? I mean, should physical determinism be vindicated by the sciences? And here's my response. Indeterminism at the level of agency, I argue, is compatible with determinism at the level of physics. As I've argued in my book and also in some earlier papers, including a 2014 paper in News on free will determinism and the possibility of doing otherwise, and also in some joint work with Marcus Pivato on emergent chance and dynamical systems, the distinction between determinism and indeterminism is a level relative distinction. So my claim is that it's not meaningful to ask, is the world deterministic or indeterministic as such? That, I claim, is strictly speaking an underspecified question. Rather, the question becomes meaningful only once we specify the level of description relative to which we are asking that question. So a system can be deterministic at one level, let's say the level of fundamental physics, and indeterministic at another level, let's say that of some special science such as biology, psychology, or sociology. When we move from a lower microscopic level to a higher macroscopic level, we might see what you might informally describe as a kind of phase transition from deterministic to indeterministic dynamics. A system's micro and macro level dynamics need not mesh, as the philosopher of physics Jeremy Butterfield puts it. Charlotte Vandel has come up with formally related results and drawn from this the conclusion that there's even an observational indistinguishability between deterministic and indeterministic theories of the world. Now, let me give you just one toy example to illustrate this level specificity of the determinism-indeterminism distinction. And this is a very simplistic example. I mean, the real world is, of course, a million times more complicated. In this very simple example, we are considering a very simple dynamical system, which is in a particular state at each point in time and whose state then evolves over time. And here, this toy world has just 5 time periods from time 1 to time 5. The little dots represent states in which the system can be at a particular point in time. And then when you've got lines connecting the dots, you've got a trajectory that the system may take across time. So I don't know whether you can see my pointer there. So if the system starts in this state, for instance, at time 1, it's going to move into that state at time 2, into that state at time 3, that state at time 4, and so on. Or likewise, if the system starts in this state at time 1, it goes to that state at time 2, that state at time 3, that state at time 4, and then that state at time 5. Now, determinism of such a system simply means that if you focus on any initial segment of any one of the possible histories of this system, this initial segment will have only one possible continuation among the nomologically possible histories of this system. And manifestly, this is the case here. So, take any initial segment of any one of these histories, and indeed among the possible histories here, which are by assumption in this toy world, all the possibilities, you'll find one and only one continuation, namely the history itself. More informally or more graphically put, you don't see any branching in any one of those histories. Okay, so far so good. Now let's interpret those states displayed here as very fine-grained microphysical states of our system. And let's run with a standard assumption of non-reductive physicalism that higher level states, so for instance, psychological states of agents qua agents, supervene on underlying physical states, but are multiply realizable at the physical level, which is to say that more than one microphysical state could bring about the same higher level mental state. Another way of putting the same point is that psychological states are more coarse-grained than microphysical states. This coarse graining is done in our psychological theories also for very good reasons, because by coarse graining in the right kind of way, we pick up certain higher level regularities and patterns that we wouldn't pick up by focusing just on the underlying microstates. Okay, so higher level states, for instance, psychological states, supervene on underlying physical states, but are multiply realizable by them. For the sake of this toy example, I'm simply going to assume that whenever two or more distinct microphysical states, lower level states, fall into the same cell within this rectangular grid, they are realizers of the same higher level state. So then basically the function that maps these little dots, the lower level states within each cell, to just one single higher level state for that cell, that would then formally represent the supervenience relation that we are considering. And so now let's look at what the states of the system look like at the higher level, as I've just described it, and what the resulting histories would look like at the higher level. And here we go. Now here the thick dots represent higher level states, and the lines connecting them represent higher level histories, and those higher level histories are simply the images of the lower level histories under the supervenience mapping that is in place here. So nothing spooky has gone on. We've basically just we've begun with the lower level histories, and we've taken the image of those lower level histories under the many-to-one supervenience mapping that takes us to higher level states, and from which we can then derive higher level histories. And you can see immediately that those higher level histories are no longer deterministic. So that is to say, now apply exactly the same definition, albeit to the higher level rather than the lower one. The initial segment of some, in fact, all of these possible higher level histories here, some of the initial segments admit more than one continuation among the possible higher level histories. So if you're embarked on this, you're embarked on this higher level history, then the higher level history could continue this way, or could continue that way, and likewise here, the higher level history could continue this way, or could continue that way. So we see immediately then that despite the fact that the subvenient lower level histories were deterministic, the supervenient higher level histories can be indeterministic. And so far, of course, that's just a formal point. We can say this is a mathematical theorem in a multi-level dynamical system. The property of determinism is not preserved under many-to-one supervenience mappings or under coarse graining, and much of the action then lies in how we philosophically interpret all of this. But I want to suggest that in line with the overall naturalistic ontological attitude that I am taking towards the properties postulated by our best sciences, not just at the physical level, but at any level, we have very good reasons to take those commitments at face value and be realists about them. And if indeed our best sciences of some higher level phenomenon postulate indeterminism within this phenomenon, and so depict the relevant systems as indeterministic, then we can take an ontic and not just an epistemic interpretation of all of this. The bottom line, to cut a long story short, and the story could be made much longer, and I'm sure people will want to ask questions about this. So to cut a long story short, the agential indeterminism assumed by the human and social sciences need not conflict with physical determinism. And I mean, I've just given you a toy example to show that lower level determinism does not entail higher level determinism. But I could have also constructed an additional example for the reverse scenario. So you could also have lower level indeterminism, but then higher level determinism as a phenomenon resulting from that. I mean, that might be relevant, for instance, to some ideas about emergent classical behavior in physics under the assumption that maybe some lower level quantum foundations turn out to be indeterministic, but these are open and hotly debated questions on which I don't need to take a stand. The point I want to emphasize is simply that lower level indeterminism is neither necessary nor sufficient for higher level indeterminism. Okay, so let me wrap up. The resulting higher level realist picture of free will that I've sketched here is metaphysically libertarian in one respect, and it's compatibilist in another. So let me begin with the respect in which it's metaphysically libertarian. It's libertarian insofar as it accepts alternative possibilities as a requirement for free will. And it accepts those alternative possibilities not just in some watered down sense, maybe under a conditional or dispositional understanding of alternative possibilities, but in a modal sense. So the alternative possibilities have to be possibilities in some appropriate sense. I suggest it's the agential notion of possibility. And it affirms that humans have alternative possibilities. And indeed, at the agential level, if we sort of truncate our picture of the world such that we focus only on the agential level in a self-contained way, at that agential level, the picture of free will that I'm describing and endorsing here looks really quite similar to the picture that I think many free will libertarians have in mind. But at the same time, the picture of free will that I'm defending here is also compatibilist insofar as it renders all this compatible with physical determinism. And there, of course, my picture is somewhat distinct from that of standard versions of libertarianism. So you might actually say that my picture is intra-level incompatibilist insofar as at the level of agency, I present a sort of libertarian account of free will, and at the level of agency, I've argued, would immediately follow from what I've suggested here, that free will is incompatible with determinism. So if you did have determinism at the level of agency, we'd no longer have free will on this picture. But despite this intra-level incompatibilism, what we have here is a form of cross-level compatibilism in the sense that the libertarian picture at the level of agency, I've argued, is compatible with determinism at the level of physics. And I mean, one might view this as a proposal to reframe at least one feature of the traditional free will debate, namely by showing that there is a form of free will libertarianism that is in fact compatibilist. You know, once we are prepared to carefully accept the leveled setup that I've used, and then carefully draw the distinction between intra and interlevel claims. Now, my defense of free will, just like the case for scientific realism about other entities and properties such as the Higgs boson that I mentioned earlier on, is contingent on the nature of our best explanations in the relevant sciences, and here in the human and social sciences. should we ever arrive at a compelling reductionistic or deterministic theory of human behavior, then the first premise of my argument, the claim about the indispensability of the assumption that humans are choice-making agents with these relevant properties, that premise would no longer be true, and my conclusion would no longer follow. But for the time being, I maintain that free will is no less real than other higher level properties or entities like organisms, institutions, or economic growth, whose reality we seldom doubt. So thank you.
Christian, that was great. Thank you. That was not a hand I was going to raise. I was supposed to clap. Now I've got a clap and a hand. This is all confusing. Let me put my hand down. Hold on one second. Okay, let me back out of the slides. Okay, so we'll just go in order for now. Do you still need the slides? Oh, you're gone, Christian. Let me
Stop sharing.
Oh, there we go. Okay. You can. I'm not sure that you see the same order of hands. I'll go in the order I see them, and we'll see where we get. So the first is by Dan.
All right, thanks. Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what you've put together. I think like the move from the indispensability of intentional agency to indispensability of alternative possibilities, I think, is right. What I'm wondering is about, like, I couldn't, to be honest, I couldn't really follow how you made sense of the kind of lower level determinism coming up to agential indeterminism. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, just kind of checking, like, what do you not mean? Do you so I don't think you mean that, say, the fundamental particles are moving in a deterministic way, and then through some kind of configuration, coming in, so once they're becoming a brain process, that then they stop moving in a deterministic way. So I take it that's not what you mean, right? So in that case, then, so we really are just talking about like a descriptive, and like we can describe the agential level as indeterministic, but at bottom it's still moving deterministically. Is that right?
Well, so I mean, your question goes right to the heart of this issue of whether we should think of higher level indeterminism in merely epistemic terms or in ontic terms. And I only briefly flagged this issue and didn't discuss it in any detail. So, I mean, a lot of people say to me, maybe we've got unpredictability at the higher level, so we are not able to predict the continuation of higher level trajectories based on higher level information alone, but that's just due to our incomplete information about the resulting lower level state. And if we were to step down to the lower level again, then, I mean, this apparent indeterminism would go away. So it's really just an epistemic phenomenon. Whereas I want to say, well, actually, no, we should really interpret higher level indeterminism ontically and not just epistemically as a real phenomenon. And I mean, here's why I think so. So, I mean, first of all, I want to emphasize that it's also not the case that other higher level properties that are postulated by the special sciences get treated by us as not real, and as just kind of epistemically useful constructs due to our incomplete information. I mean, we'd never say that, unemployment is not a real phenomenon, it's just because we have this sort of coarse-grained picture of the economy and society that abstracts away from microphysical details that we make use of this construct. But it doesn't really exist. We wouldn't say that. I mean, normally we'd be quite prepared to acknowledge that if our best theories of a particular domain centrally invoke a particular property, then so be it, and we are prepared to be realists. And now my claim is that once you've got a special science theory of a particular domain that in which an indeterministic depiction of the relevant phenomena plays some central, also explanatory role, then in line with this general explanatory practice, we should be realists about that. And I mean, for much the same reasons, I'm also inclined to be a realist about higher level chance or higher level randomness in those phenomena where our best scientific theories depict them as stochastic. I mean, I have absolutely no problem with saying that there is genuine stochasticity in weather systems, for instance, despite the fact that maybe at some lower level, the atmosphere might have classical physical deterministic foundations, but it's the same sort of logic. If our best theories of meteorology depict the weather system as an indeterministic system, then I'm inclined to be a realist about that. And so those are the considerations that move me towards an ontic and not just epistemic understanding of a higher level indeterminism.
Okay, so all I ask is if you ask the question, keep your hand up till you're done, because otherwise you disappear from my screen. I've got to like fish around to find you, to foreground you again. So just leave the hand up until your question's over. Randy, you're up. How are you?
I'm good, Thomas. Thanks. And thanks, Christian. Really interesting talk. So I have a question about the indispensability of the alternative possibilities for behavioral and social sciences. So I wonder whether what's indispensable there is, say, the real availability of plural options or the apparent availability of plural options. So, so you think about a slight modification of this famous case from John Locke. A guy is in a room, and there's in the room a friend. Let's say the guy is also at some point needs to run an errand, so he considers run the errand now or hang around and talk to my friend. Opts for the latter. Unbeknownst to him, but the room's locked. He couldn't leave. So we could explain his choice just by recognizing he thinks he has these two options, and he sees he has better reason to stay in the room and talk to his friend. So that's why he chooses. So I wonder why that wouldn't be, say, good enough. Maybe the behavioral and social scientists actually do attribute real options, but is it indispensable to the science that they do that? Might the science get along with recognizing, well, people commonly think they have plural options, and they deliberate among what they think the options to be?
Yeah, so I mean the example, although it's a nice example, of course, doesn't completely convince me for the reason that even though if you focus on sort of fully taking these different courses of action to completion, the alternative option of leaving the room clearly wasn't available. I mean, had he tried, he would not have been able to open the door. But an attempt to do that was certainly available to him, and in addition, the mental act of choosing to try to do one thing rather than another thing was also available to him. So at the sort of crucial psychological explanatory level, I think we are dealing with an instance of branching here even though unbeknownst to him, had he, branched off in one particular direction, it would have not quite taken him to the sort of note that he subjectively expected to find there. And decision theorists acknowledge that sort of phenomenon by sometimes having more sophisticated decision theoretic models with a sort of further layer of complexity, where you have not just in the model a description of the extensive form decision tree as it really is, let's say from the Olympian perspective of the all-informed modeler or theorist explaining this, but where in addition you also have some informational assumption about how the agent subjectively perceives the choice situation. And those two, I mean, as your example nicely illustrates, can come apart. But the mere fact that drawing that distinction also turns out to be explanatory useful for the purposes of decision theory, I'm inclined to think sort of further supports my case that we can't sort of throw out the assumption, the background assumption that there is a decision tree as it is from some kind of objective perspective or external perspective of the model, and something would be lost if we were to focus just on decision trees as seen through the lens of the agent.
Good. Okay. Well, so Dirk, you were here. You were in the hot seat the last time, so now you can put Christian in the hot seat this time.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Hi, Christian. So it's a question about your toy example, figure 1 and figure 2. So I accept your argument, the one that you made in this talk, that that you can show that type level, lower level determinism doesn't entail type level, higher level determinism. That seems right. But in the book and elsewhere, you want to use this claim to show that in my particular situation now, I could have done otherwise than how I in fact acted. And so when I look at, when I compare figure 1 and figure 2, it does seem that say my particular desire leads to a particular action. So it does seem, it seems that my particular desire could leads to a distinct action from the one I actually perform only in situations in which the realizer of my desire is different, right? So, so I guess the question is, like, how do you respond to an opponent that says, look, it does seem as if your view isn't really a kind of metaphysical libertarianism, it's a kind of metaphysical compatibilism, because in the end what you're doing is you're not holding actual realizers fixed. So, David Lewis doesn't hold the laws fixed, he and Dorr doesn't hold the past fixed, and what you're really doing is not holding the actual realizers fixed. If you were to hold the actual realizers of the preceding states fixed, then you wouldn't get the ability to do otherwise.
Yeah, so I think to formulate this objection, you need to basically step down to the lower level, and you need to then be able to conditionalize on lower level realizers and look at everything through that lower level perspective. And indeed, I mean, if you do this and we've got lower level determinism, then the lower level trajectory would indeed be completely fixed by fixing the initial lower level state. So that much, I mean, I have to grant if I accept that there could be lower level determinism. But my response here would simply be to kind of reject the framing of the whole thing. Namely, I would want to say, well, the key move that I'm making, and that I think needs to be made in order to engage in higher level discourse, higher level explanations about human agency, the key move is to really look at all of this from a higher level perspective, and to then take the level specificity of all of this sort of absolutely seriously, and not implicitly collapse everything back into a sort of flat lowest level ontology again. And if we conduct our analysis solely at the higher level, then and we only even use concepts and categories that allow us to speak about higher level states and properties and so on. Then this whole business of conditionalizing on lower level states is not even applicable. And so my claim is that at the higher level, in higher level terms, there isn't even a fact of the matter, certainly not a higher level fact of the matter as to what the sort of actual realizer is. So basically, I think we've got sort of two different ways of framing the whole thing. You can have a flat ontological picture with a very strongly privileged lowest or fundamental level. And then this objection on the face of it looks clearly very compelling. Or you could embrace this multi-level ontological picture and embrace the sort of level specificity, and that's sort of my move. And then you kind of lose the framing for that objection. So I suppose that's sort of my attempt to explain my response briefly.
Okay.
And I'm sure more.
So quick response. I completely accept your multi-level view, and I think that explanations in the higher level special sciences should be higher level explanations. So I accept all of that. My concern is that when you're asking the question, could I have done otherwise? I want to say, look, it can't be denied that my desire has the specific realizer that it does. Okay? And that's going to play a role in deciding whether you could have done otherwise. Now, look, that's all compatible with my saying in the end, I want to be a compatibilist of your sort, of the sort. I want to accept the kind of compatibilism that in my initial question I was attributing to you, namely a kind of compatibilism that doesn't hold the realizers fixed, right? But it's still a kind of compatibilism, just as Lewis's view is a compatibilism because it doesn't hold the laws fixed.
Well, I have no problem with accepting that it's a kind of compatibilism. I even emphasize that it's a form of interlevel compatibilism. That's the sort of compatibilism bit in the label for the position. But I suppose I simply want to note that the answer to the could question that you've asked, even if we interpret the could in modal terms through the lens of some appropriate possibility notion, that depends very much on which possibility notion we plug in there. And so if you plug in a possibility notion that can make recourse to lower level states and conditionalize on lower level states, then you get a negative answer to the question, as you've just pointed out. And if you plug in the higher level modal notion of agential possibility that that I've argued is the right and important one here, then we get a positive answer, a yes answer to the could question. And then of course to some extent I'm also relying a little bit on linguistic evidence from maybe the semantics of ordinary language can, going back, for instance, to the classic work of Kratzer, to suggest that my agential understanding of could is not even so out of line with ordinary language uses. But for me, the ordinary language issue is kind of secondary to the claim that the agential modal notions here are supported by our explanatory practices of the relevant special sciences.
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself. Gunnar.
Thank you, Christian. I want to be a little clearer about the dialectics here. So you started off saying that you were responding to recent challenges to free will coming from the sciences. And so you respond by saying that on the right understanding of scientific realism, we get the result that alternative possibilities, for example, are real, at least looking at how say, economics or the behavioral sciences look today, or psychology. But I wonder what this has to do, or to what extent this connects with sort of the philosophical discussion about free will skepticism. So at least prima facie, it seems to me that what philosophers are worried about when it comes to determinism isn't high-level determinism. It doesn't matter, say, whether the manipulator is using intentional tools, manipulating the beliefs and desires, or the brain states described at some other level. The worry about manipulation appears in any case. Or if we think about worries about whether the agent settled what option he took in a proper way, in a way that makes him responsible for that, then it's not clear that we are really helped by looking at a higher level. We're saying nothing at that level settles it. Okay, is that a strength or a worry then? So the question is just, how does this, the picture you painted, connect to the philosophical debate about free will skepticism?
Yes, I think it also connects with the philosophical debate. Of course, the philosophical debate is massive, so I'll just give some examples of aspects of that debate that I think it connects with. I mentioned, for instance, the classic causal exclusion argument given by Jack-Won Kim against mental causation, at least on the assumption that mental states are distinct from physical states. And if you accept the identity of mental states and physical states, then you can have mental causation on a sort of reductive physicalist picture in line with Kim's analysis. Now, that sort of argument, an argument against mental causation of a non-reductive sort, I mean, can very easily also be turned into an argument against free will. I mean, at least to the extent that free will requires that the agent has causal control over the resulting actions. And so then my defense of mental causation, which I developed largely in collaboration with Peter Menzies, that invokes a difference-making account of causation, can be viewed as one attempt to show how some form of causal settling of the agent's actions by the agent is indeed defensible against some prominent philosophical challenges. So that's sort of one example where it connects with the philosophical debate. But I mean, another one that is, of course, perhaps the most central bit of the philosophical debate, relevant to the discussion today here, is Van Inwagen's classic consequence argument. And I mean, here my picture of free will also suggests a particular response to this. My response to the consequence argument, in short, is that as formulated by Van Inwagen, the argument mixes modal operators from two different levels of description. It mixes, very low level, let's say, physical modal operators, those that would pick out what is possible or not under the most fundamental laws, and then it mixes this with agential modal operators, and this level mixing, as should be at least somewhat evident from my talk today, goes against the kind of approach that I've defended. And my response to the consequence argument then is to say, if we carefully separate out the different levels and be careful not to mix low-level and high-level modal operators, then we can avoid the consequence argument. But I've got a whole paper on the consequence argument in Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, in which I developed this response in a little bit more detail. So these are just two examples of how this approach speaks to the philosophical debate.
Can I make a very short follow-up question? But would you agree that there are cross-level laws? Say you have medicine that affects thinking in certain ways, and we have some kind of sense of what sort of bridging that's taking place, how these chemicals affects neurons, that affects thought in such and such a way. So are you against all cross-level principles of that sort, or just?
Well, I mean, for a start, there are the sort of basic cross-level relations of the form of supervenience relations, which are clearly in place as constraints between levels. But then, I mean, my suggestion is that when we engage in this kind of enterprise that you've described as, let's say, cross-level analysis in the sciences, what we're really doing in those kinds of analyses is we are carving out a sort of new level that uses a somewhat different partitioning of some underlying space of microstates into coarse-grained higher level states. So we we end up having descriptions that are maybe more fine-grained than the descriptions of what was previously the higher level domain, but which are still more coarse-grained than the sort of proper lower level descriptions in some other respects. But I mean, of course, that's an important and complex set of issues that I wouldn't be able to do justice to in just a 1-minute answer.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, some people disappeared. Let me make sure that I didn't lose. Hey, Michael McKenna, do you still have a question, or Dave Shoemaker? You had hands up and then you vanished.
Well, I vanished because I thought we were done. Time-wise, I didn't want to.
It's okay. I mean, I think as long as Christian's willing to answer maybe another question or two, I'm happy to, because it's his time.
I'll go quick.
I'm happy to volunteer Christian's time is what I'm trying to say.
I'll go quick. I actually have to do something with my little monster who just got home from school early today. So, Christian, I've never met you before, so hi, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually. I enjoyed your talk a lot too, and my question is really pretty similar to Dirk's, but I want to try to put it in a slightly different way. So I'll just put it as a kind of challenge, and I mean it in a friendly way. I actually want to offer some support. But the challenge is that it looks like you've replicated for compatibilists a kind of luck problem. So that if you look at the model that you have, you could have an agent who's, in terms of the level of resolution or description in terms of mental states, has a set of desires or a set of reasons, maybe they have an intention or something like that. And at that level of resolution, it's possible, it's agentially possible that the agent, shoots Smith, or the agent doesn't shoot Smith, or whatever, right? But the agent could be in that very same mental state or set of mental states with the very same reasons and do one thing or another. And it looks like on your model, there's nothing that the agent can do to settle which of the two things the agent can do. And then it makes it a kind of lock, whether the agent shoots Smith or not. Now, one of the things you might say about this is that's just a cost of being a compatibilist. I mean, you might just bite that bullet, but it is a kind of luck problem, I think, for the kind of compatibilism you have.
Yeah, thank you. And in fact, I just want to mention that Al Mealy has actually pressed a similar challenge. I have a few things to say on this. In fact, in my book, I have a sort of short discussion of this at the very end of my chapter on alternative possibilities. So, I mean, first of all, the standard libertarians have come up with a bunch of different strategies or candidate strategies for addressing this, and with different levels of success. And I mean, those of course remain debated in the literature. mean, let's say Robert Kane has one particular strategy. It's not necessarily the one that I would take, but it is an elaborate and sophisticated strategy that he has carefully developed, and there are others. Al Mealy himself offers some such strategies without necessarily endorsing them, but he's spent time thinking about what they could look like. Now, the first thing I want to note is that in principle, it's possible to sort of lift a bunch of these strategies up to the agential level as well, and make use of structurally similar arguments to address the lack problem. My own preferred response to the lack problem is actually to say, well, insofar as free will on my picture involves not just alternative possibilities, but also intentional agency and mental causation, and insofar as I think we have a higher level account of what intentional agency involves, and we have a higher level account of what mental causation involves, we can actually give an account of what settling as a higher level notion now means. Namely, settling as a higher level notion means that the agent's relevant mental state, the agent's intention, is the difference-making cause of the action, and difference-making cause understood in appropriate counterfactual terms, maybe along the lines of the interventionist framework. And so, if you go with the sort of whole logic of the higher level picture, you could say, well, the agent chose one thing rather than another. Both options were available. The option that the agent did in fact choose was rationalized by the agent's mental state as depicted by our intentional explanation of the agent. And furthermore, the agent's mental state was the difference-making cause of the resulting action. And so I sort of suggest that if you take on board this level picture and you kind of give up the worry that we need to be able to sort of step down to the lower level as well, then we actually do have resources to address that lack problem. But I mean, you're absolutely right that to the extent that I'm embracing a somewhat libertarian architecture at the agential level, I then have to confront similar objections that my libertarian friends and colleagues face in the more let's say full-blown libertarian position.
Sure. Can a quick follow-up? Do you mind, Thomas? Or
no, you're fine.
Yeah, I hear my kid causing trouble in the back, so I'll just let him cause trouble a little longer. So that's a plausible reply. That is to seek some compatibilist way of identifying what we're going to mean by settling. It just still seems odd, though, to appeal to the notion of settling and just think that in a certain respect, you take the state of the agent, given those mental states, and knowing, so to speak, that they're drilled down and supervening on some other feature. There's some sense, surely, even available to a compatibilist understanding, in which it's now no longer up to the agent to settle what the agent does. I mean, so here's a different. So you said Al Mealy has a solution. There's Al, and I'll speak for Al now, which should maybe a little bit. But part of his resolution is just to accept that there's a certain kind of agent involving luck that's just intrinsically or internally related to certain kinds of free decisions. And you could borrow that. I mean, Al calls that daring soft libertarianism, and I advised him to call it swashbuckling as a better marketing title for his libertarianism. But anyway, that would be my advice, is to just embrace the luck.
Yeah, I mean, I of course I understand your comeback. I mean, what I would say though is that your comeback, which basically challenges this what you've called compatibilist notion of settling that is being employed here, that comeback relies on the same kind of lower level framing of the issue that Dirk's objection also relied upon. And if we grant that framing, then I already said that Dirk's objection was powerful, and then your comeback to my response, likewise, is a very plausible comeback. But that's simply a framing that I think does not sufficiently embrace the leveled picture and the sort of level specificity of the analysis. And then this sort of difference-making account of an agent's causal control, I would suggest is simply the sort of settling, or whatever you might call it, that is needed at the higher level in order to really make sure that you can attribute the resulting action to the agent's mental state rather than to something else.
Thank you. I see Al put a hand up. I hope I instigated that, but I hope to hear.
Yeah. So I know Ryan is a grad student working on some of your work, Christian, but Al's is a follow-up, I imagine. So I want to give Al a chance to come in on a swashbuckling, non-swashbuckling distinction, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to switch to swashbuckling. Michael's right about that. I feel silly not saying anything, but I'm going to see Christian at 4 a.m. on Zoom on Friday, so I thought I would just take it easy today. But it's been fun.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, good. So then, Ryan, I'll let you you can have the last question, and we'll call it quits, because I've kept Christian longer than expected, but hopefully he's gotten some good questions and good feedback. So.
Excellent. Hello, Dr. List. I was curious. I think there seems to be this conception, perhaps like a folk psychology conception, that free will or intentional agents also need to be self-aware or conscious. I was wondering if you could briefly speak to that, if you think it's necessary, if it's not necessary.
Yeah, that's a very good question. In my book and my sort of official account, I've remained sort of silent on this, and so I've in the book I've given largely a third-personal analysis of free will, and looked at the 3 prerequisites for free will: intentional agency, alternative possibilities, and causal control, all from the third personal perspective of an outside observer trying to make sense of an agent. Now, clearly, the sort of rich intentional agency that we find in humans comes equipped with a very rich mental life, and not just one that can be third personally described by a, let's say, psychologist or cognitive scientist looking at the human being, but obviously there are first personal states, there's first personal consciousness, and it's a massive, hugely important philosophical question under what conditions intentional agency with a rich mental life is and is not accompanied by consciousness. And I mean, I'm deeply interested in this question, and I independently have views about that question, but I just didn't want to make my theory of free will contingent in any way on how we settle those debates about consciousness. And so I've kind of decided to stick to the methodological principle of sort of modularizing the analysis. So this is a third personal theory, and so I don't need to discuss at least phenomenal consciousness as first personally experienced, but only maybe discuss those aspects of consciousness that, let's say, what Dave Chalmers and others have called consciousness as awareness, which are third personal features that might be important features involved in various agential capacities. But I've kind of remained somewhat silent here on the whole debate about phenomenal consciousness.
Okay, Christian, that was amazing. Thank you so much for your time and your energy. I know all of us got a lot out of this, and it was great hearing everyone interact with your ideas. So hopefully we'll see you in one of these threads when someone else is giving a talk. You're welcome back at any time. I'll send you a link once I get everything up, if you're interested in having it, and we'll go from there. The rest of you, thanks for showing up, and I'll see you all hopefully next time.
Thanks very much from me as well. I really enjoyed the session, and it's wonderful to see you all, albeit just virtually. So I hope in the future we'll also get a chance to meet in person again.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye, Christian.
Bye-bye then.